It's true. I went to Turning Point USA's America Fest, and I'm here to tell you all about my experience. If you don't know, America Fest is probably the largest conservative conference in America besides CPAC that happens with over 10,000 people in attendance. The event is a who's who of politicians, political pundits, podcast personalities, and celebrities in Christian nationalist spaces. It's also an event loaded with Christian language and symbolism, but more on that later on. Before I give you the overview, I have to give you a few caveats first. The goal of this video is to give you my honest to God experience at this event. It lasts for 4 days, and I was there for every one of those days in its entirety from morning until night. I did my best to fully experience the event, but of course, there is much I couldn't get to, so this will be a high-level overview with as much detail as possible. We will release a podcast episode next week doing a deep dive on it. This video is more focused on what I saw, more than responding to everything that I saw, so don't expect me to disarm every single point I talk about in this video. That's impossible. We have other podcasts and videos doing some of that stuff. This is designed to give you information and you can interpret it however you like, although of course I will have my color commentary throughout. Early on, I realized I had to make a decision. Do I sit in the main auditorium listening to speaker after speaker, or do I spend my day walking the booths, the media section, and trying to meet new people and hearing their stories? While I did listen to a few speakers, I chose to mainly focus on the latter because that's something you can only do while you're there. I should also mention that here at the New Evangelicals, privacy and consent is paramount to what we do as an organization. And because I did not get explicit consent in every conversation I had with very prominent figures in these spaces, I will not be name dropping who said what. This is not a gotcha video, but this is an honest take on what I saw and heard. I will be using the term Christian Nationalist instead of conservative in this video because I believe it more accurately represents the event and the leaders of the movement. See this tweet by Turning Point's founder, Charlie Kirk, for example. This is not a conservative movement. This is a Christian nationalist one. My goal was to be as kind and loving towards everyone I met and to engage with them honestly, with integrity, and honoring the image of God that was stamped on them. At the New Evangelicals, we have a strict policy of non-dehumanization because we believe dehumanization puts us on the path to violence. I didn't lie to people about who I wasn't undercover, this wasn't a Project Veritas piece, I didn't use sound bites here to get them into a corner. That's a game that we do not play. And personally, I believe that there is no need to spin anything in these spaces. There is plenty to find concerning by listening to what they say plainly and in context. Lastly, I do want to say I met many people who were incredibly kind, open to what I was doing, and who thanked me for coming. I recognize that my privilege plays a role in this. After all, I can pass as a bro-evangelical, so I decided to use that privilege to really connect and understand as much as I could so I can better explain why we are deeply concerned and troubled as an organization about Christian nationalism and the culture it's creating. I can still speak this language fluently, so I did, and I am really grateful for all the people, many of who we have critiqued on our account and vice versa, for their willingness to shake my hand and talk to me. A sincere thank you. First, you need to understand that Turning Point USA is a massive, massive organization that is incredibly well-funded and connected. For example, in its 2020 fiscal year, they claimed $55 million in revenue, and they really have become the central hub for people in Christian nationalism to fight for control of family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And yes, if you counted, that is 7 spheres of influence. And yes, I am referencing the 7 Mountain Mandate, which is something Charlie referenced at the 2020 CPAC conference. Charlie, speaking about Trump, said, quote, "Finally, we have a president that understands the 7 mountains of cultural influence," unquote. This makes sense, and you can see these focuses emerging through its several organizations under the Turning Point brand. Here's how some of them break down. First, you have Turning Point USA that targets conservative young adults through college work. Second, you have Turning Point Faith, which targets religion. Thirdly, Turning Point Academy targets education, and Turning Point Action targets politics. I spoke to a staff member for Turning Point Action and confirmed they quadrupled their revenue this year. Turning Point also has other micro movements inside of it, such as Turning Point Alumni, that I was told is a way for conservatives to network in business. It was also clear that this event is a hub for what's called the parallel economy. Do you want Christian nationalist phone services? Patriot Mobile is your provider. Do you want a payment processor that isn't woke. Revere payments could be a good option. There's also a new platform coming out called Freedom Square that will be a one-stop hub for all podcasts, businesses, and resources in these spaces. I even spoke to one of the partners behind the app, and they told me that they are close to securing an interview with Clarence Thomas, yes, that Clarence Thomas, a Supreme Court justice, to premiere on the app when it launches in 2023. It was also evident that this parallel economy has its own news networks with close to 20 different news organizations present, most of which you likely have never heard of. Fox News was not there, but OAN was. I should also mention here that this was a young crowd. I would say the average age was maybe 28, 30. Hard to tell, but that's my best guess. And Turning Point staff also seemed to be primarily in their 20s. It was predominantly white, but there were several exhibitors and popular personalities that were black, so it was not as white as you might expect. Turning Point staff also seemed to be primarily in their 20s. It was predominantly white, but there were several exhibitors and popular personalities that were black, so it was not as white as you might expect. One thing that surprised me, and honestly maybe it shouldn't have, is Turning Point's push into the academic world. They now have another wing called Turning Point Academy that is partnering with churches to essentially build their own education network. For example, Dream City Church, which has worked closely with Turning Point Faith, is now also affiliated with Turning Point Academy through their school, Dream City Christian. This school promises to teach children to never waver from things like self-government and to reject all woke and untruthful ideologies, including CRT, postmodernism, and to give them what is called a biblical worldview. I spoke to a lady at the Turning Point Academy booth and asked her if they were curating any curriculum from Doug Wilson's Logos Press. She said, yes, they are. It was one of several they were pulling from. This honestly did make my jaw drop, and for more information, check out our interview with Doug Wilson on our podcast. Turning Point Academy claims to be a movement, not a school, focused on what they call the 5 C's, being Christian, classical, conservative, church-based, and cost-affordable. This is going to be a massive, massive push in the future, along with the push for what is known as school choice. For example, many in these spaces are working on expanding taxpayer-subsidized credits that can be used to attend private religious schools. The political rhetoric was expected, but it was still incredibly dehumanizing. Trump Jr. called Joe Biden a moron several times in his speech to a round of applause, and there's a non-stop fire hose of talking points that comes from that stage. Democrats are pure evil. Liberals want to destroy the family. Groomers are coming for the kids. Wokeism is going to destroy America, and the left is completely insane. Were all prevalent and consistent themes I heard by both the big-time names, but also in small talk as I walked around the exhibit throughout the day. I did hear 2 instances where someone from a stage said that Democrats were not the enemy, the devil is, but that was largely overshadowed by the rest of the event. Honestly, it's a very interesting combination of rhetoric that simultaneously wants you to be afraid of the liberals, but at the same time, God is on your side, so you're definitely going to win in the end, but also make sure you arm yourself with the gun, but also you don't need a vaccine because Jesus heals. That's a real thing, by the way, I heard a prominent Christian nationalist leader say from the platform. I need to also mention that there were a lot of people with Trump won hats and shirts walking around. I asked people what were some of the pressing issues that America had to deal with, and election integrity was consistently brought up. Carrie Lake, for example, who recently lost her gubernatorial bid in Arizona, also claimed at the event that her election was rigged to a round of applause and amens. Truthfully, I do struggle with how to have this conversation with people in these spaces who really believe that they are standing on objective truth, but also who tell me that the election in 2020 was stolen despite the Mount Everest-sized pile of data saying otherwise. Nevertheless, it was a prominent theme that I had to mention. There was also a major theme of political persecution. We'll get to the religious side later on. There was a breakout session called Canceled, where the panel discussed how they lost everything when they didn't close down their business during lockdowns or post a black square on social media, or when they reported news that exposed Antifa. Now, I do want to say emphatically that death threats, doxing people, and threatening violence is a hard stop for the new evangelicals. One of the panelists described the messages she received from people telling her to kill herself or that they were going to kill her family. That honestly made me tear up legitimately. It's horrible, it's dehumanizing, and it puts us on the path towards violence. The internet exposes how vile people can be behind a keyboard, and honestly, I hope there is a heavy amen despite where you land on the political spectrum. But this feeling of canceled, despite all three of the panelists now being borderline celebrities in this movement, ran deep throughout the event, with people using that as a reason to fight the tyranny of the left. I should also note that it seemed like the more vitriolic the threats that were sent to these people were, the more it hardlined those people in their positions. It almost felt as if they took that attack as a sign that they were doing something right, or that God was telling them to keep going. One person, for example, said that she took a slur used by the left towards her and made it her entire brand. This received a round of applause. The politics were mainly centered around right-wing culture war issues, although CRT, that's critical race theory, wasn't really present like it was last year, which either means they eradicated what they think CRT is, or they found a more effective talking point and focused on it. I would say it was probably the latter, because the term grooming was all over the place. Phrases like the trans ideology and the queer agenda and we need to protect our kids were commonplace throughout my 4 days. And look, I gotta say, as a parent, I would do anything to protect my kids. If you think there is someone out there trying to sexually abuse your kid or groom them to make them easier to be preyed upon, it makes sense why they would be so militant about it. I just wish they would actually look where actual child abuse is happening, like, for example, in their evangelical churches. The other focus was the midterms. The big names did their job and spoke to the masses to encourage them that while the battle might have been lost, the war has just begun. One of the things that I noticed was this sense of, because the enemy, that's liberals, fight dirty in their perspective, they need to start fighting fire with fire. This makes sense because I have noticed some hints that small government is no longer the goal in these spaces, but instead fighting for control of the power of the government to enact their will is key. And make no mistake, these politics of Turning Point USA and Christian nationalism is steeped in war language. For example, while at my hotel bar, I overheard someone say, pick your fucking side. You're either pro-America, pro-Constitution, or you want to destroy the country. This sums up the atmosphere politically and religiously. Honestly, out of all the different things to explore, Turning Point Faith probably interested me the most. Ultimately, Turning Point Faith is very evangelical, but in a big tent kind of way, with both New Apostolic Reformation and Calvinist speakers present. It seems to me that this is perhaps one of the biggest new focuses for Turning Point, and they are focusing on building a network of churches from all evangelical backgrounds into a coalition that becomes an outpost for their far-right politics, but rooted in a sense of piety and devotion to Jesus. Of course, I had a lot of questions. Primarily, how can people in this space tolerate such a dehumanization of the other from speakers and content that Turning Point produces? Most of the answers I got were something like, I don't like it and it's not ideal, but regardless, they sit and listen to it. They share it from their social media platforms, and they have no problem being recognized as a Turning Point contributor online. It's hard to pin down an exact theology of what Turning Point Faith actually believes, as I wasn't able to find a what we believe statement on their website, but they do say the following, quote, TPUSA Faith is serving pastors, faith leaders, churches, and believers across the nation by building an active network of churches, local faith groups, community impact events, registering voters, and educating the Christian community on the connection between faith and freedom, unquote. They espouse pretty typical Christian nationalist rhetoric and seem to have made up new boundaries of what really counts as a true Christian or not.
Okay. Can you be pro-choice and a pastor?
No, there's no such thing.
Can you support BLM and be a Christian, the organization?
There's no way you can do that.
Can you make an idol out of conservatism and be a Christian?
You cannot rightly, you can make an idol out of it, but you should not. And that would be sinful and wrong. And as a result, that should not be the way that Christians operate.
Can you vote blue and be a Christian?
I don't believe you can anymore. I really don't. The only way to be informed about those things are opening up God's Word, examining what the Word of God says, and being informed as you go into the poll booth.
I had the opportunity to talk to some of the people who work behind the scenes, and they were incredibly cordial and polite, but they did seem to shy away from saying that Turning Point Faith was there to advance a political agenda. However, All you have to do is watch content on their Instagram or from some of their influencers that they are connected to, or see some of their tweets to see that faith in Christ is directly linked to right-wing policies, and you cannot be a Christian if you're not bought in on those specific culture war points. It's also worth noting here that Turning Point Faith is already building a network of churches that will host folks like Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, and Tucker Carlson at their church events. Dream City Church with Pastor Luke Barnett and Pastor Rob McCoy of Godspeed Calvary Chapel are two major players in this space who both have profiles on Turning Point's website. Now, I must say that I believe at some point Turning Point Faith and the pastors connected to all of this will start antagonizing the federal government as they push the boundaries of the Johnson Amendment, which states that nonprofits must not endorse political candidates. This is my speculation, but it's not without evidence, as Eric Metaxas in his book, Letter to the American Church, believes that the Johnson Amendment is actually silencing the free speech of the church and therefore must be overturned. So much of what fuels this movement is based in an existential threat out there that is coming for them in here. This is grounded in a deep American Christian persecution complex, which I must say truly baffles me, considering that 96 or 98% of our Congress is Christian. The Supreme Court is a majority Christian. There are over 250,000 churches in America. There's a movie industry, there's a publishing industry, a music industry, and even a church industry that makes a lot of people a lot of money and gives them a lot of power. There's a Christian lobbying industry. There are groups who advance far-right Christian nationalist legislation in all 50 states via what's known as Project Blitz. Look it up. There are parachurch organizations in thousands of public schools indoctrinating kids into their brand of Christian fundamentalism. In fact, several people at this event who from the stage claimed that they were persecuted during COVID lockdowns were also meeting with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, attending the Super Bowl, and raising millions of dollars in 2020. I'd say that instead of Christian persecution, America is a land of Christian privilege, and evangelicals are one of the biggest benefactors. But the feeling of imminent threat is incredibly effective and has been for a long time. Satanic panic, the gay agenda, feminism, liberals, CRT, grooming, etc. All it takes is a light reading of the history of this movement to see there has always been a boogeyman to be afraid of. But perhaps one of the most shocking moments for me was sitting in on a breakout session on the church and culture where Sean Foyt told the audience that the pandemic was a gift and that politicians have always wanted to silence the American church. What? There was no mention of the 1 million+ deaths that COVID caused. There was instead a downplaying of the pandemic and a lot of fear-mongering that the government became tyrannical during shutdown and that good Christians have an obligation to resist tyranny. In fact, the quote by Thomas Jefferson, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," was used over and over again in these spaces to a round of applause and hearty amens. I will say it's a little ironic that Thomas Jefferson, who is seen as this big hero of the faith in these spaces, cut out the miracles and resurrection of Jesus in his own Bible, but I digress. There were also a lot of parallels made to Nazi Germany and what is coming to America if the church doesn't get bold. Bold about what? Apparently fighting for more of their privilege and demanding that Christians run for political office to make America a godly nation again. There was no specific policies mentioned besides run for office so you can defeat evil in all branches and all levels of government. And perhaps that is one of my most surprising takeaways from this event. I didn't hear any real solutions to real issues America is facing. How do we lower inflation? No idea. How do we get affordable healthcare figured out? No idea. Right now in America, 50% of single working parents and BIPOC workers make under $15 an hour. How do we solve that? They didn't say. Now, of course, I couldn't be everywhere at once, so perhaps these issues were talked about with real solutions given, but I was hard-pressed to find good solutions being offered and saw nothing of the sort in any of the titles for the sessions at the event. Instead, I mostly heard about how dangerous everything out there was and how everyone in here must arm themselves with God and country to fight back the evil forces of tyranny. But what does that actually mean? Who are these people and what are they actually doing? No idea. There were also a lot of jokes made at the expense of liberals, the queer community, and social justice warriors. But it seems like this all boils down to mobilizing a base to take over the country so they can rule from the top down. The language of "we're on God's side" is the solid foundation that gives people this radicalization that they are doing the will of God that just happens to be steeped in supremacy and far-right politics. We can look back in history and see how this language radicalizes people to conquer their enemies through violence. This is crusader language, and there's no way around it. But honestly, if I'm being truthful with you, I don't think most of the people I met understand that. It is very jarring to meet so many people in these spaces, be warmly welcomed in, engage in good faith dialogue, and recognize that these are human beings, not some boogeyman I made up in my mind. But then see that these policies that they're advocating for do so much harm to people in our society. I really feel like I have to wrestle with these two realities. There will be times where some righteous anger is necessary, but I also recognize that you get more flies with honey. For example, my video gently asking Kim Walker-Smith about her involvement in this event leading worship actually led me to meeting with Kim for over an hour where I was able to share my concerns with her genuinely. Would that have happened if I screamed into a camera calling her a dangerous Christian nationalist? Probably not. Honestly, I'm still thinking through this part of my whole experience. I'm working through the fact that I have privilege here and that it's easier to hold this position when this movement isn't talking about the straight white men who are coming for your kids to groom them. Regardless, I'm here to share my experience and thoughts as truthfully and honestly as I can. Did this event change me? Yeah, it did. It made me more committed to not building an organization based on propaganda, dehumanization, and religious fundamentalism. I must say, it is so strange to me that America Fest, which is run by Christians who are devoted to Jesus in their own words, would host a worship night but also ask someone like Benny Johnson, who's also a Christian, to speak at this event. Benny recently tweeted out that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is an ungrateful piece of shit. Again, what Jesus are we following here? What Bible are we reading? I still cannot get a good answer whenever I ask. And I asked one of the biggest pastors in this movement this exact question and essentially got, yeah, it's not my favorite, but... And I think this is telling because while they say Christian values is their primary motivation, it seems to me that this is really a Trojan horse to take more power and more control in our society, which is rooted in the belief that America is God's chosen nation. And no, I'm not kidding, as is demonstrated in Eric Metaxas's book, where he says, quote, God has sovereignly chosen us to hold the torch of liberty for all the world, and that the church is central to doing this, unquote. How is this a Christian value? It perplexes me, but this is the belief that underpins all of this and cannot be underestimated. As much as being at America Fest only reinforced my concerns with Christian nationalism, how powerful it is, and how militant it is, it also humanized it for me. It reminded me that these are people fully human, made in the image of God. Many have families, many are young and trying to understand the world and don't know anything beyond the bubble they're growing up in. I understand that, I get it. Some are genuinely doing good work, fighting the legitimate human trafficking of people all over the world, including in America. That is great and should be celebrated. And honestly, I'm not sure if the majority of the people attending this event know the waters they're swimming in. This is my honest assessment. I don't think they know that evangelicals in American history have consistently been on the wrong side of things like slavery, segregation, and women's rights, etc. I doubt they know that Jerry Falwell Sr. started the moral majority over maintaining school segregation, not abortion. I doubt they know this because the leaders and influencers they listen to don't talk about it. This world is incredibly insular. It seems to fear any knowledge or data coming from outside the bubble it's constructed, and it has a defense mechanism of calling outside information Marxist, liberal, or fake news, which keeps its followers firmly comfortable and seated inside of its own belief system. Look, if you're someone I met at this event and you're watching this, I want to first say thank you. Thank you for being so kind to me, for bringing me in, and for being willing to talk. My doors are always open and I will talk to you anytime. But here's my question. If we both claim to share an allegiance to the way of Jesus, and that's our highest ideal above political allegiance, I must ask you to look at the language used by so many of the leaders in your space and ask, where is Jesus in any of it? Is calling people pieces of shit Christ-like? How about calling a sitting president a moron, or mocking trans folks who are navigating an experience you'll never be fully able to understand? Is Jesus in the half-truths that are espoused in this movement? Does Jesus really believe and teach us that conquering our enemies is truly being Christ-like? And if you're someone watching this and you, like me, are really concerned about Christian nationalism, I hope you ask yourself what is the best way to persuade folks in those spaces that there are better ways forward while also resisting such a movement for the sake of our neighbors. And look, I'm certainly not claiming to have an answer to this. And when push comes to shove, I believe we must prioritize our neighbors that this movement targets over persuasion. But my gosh, can we at least try? Can we at least try to find ways to plant seeds of doubt that hopefully get people to think twice before they subscribe to this movement? Perhaps I'm so sensitive to this because this was my past life. While certainly not a Christian nationalist, I was on the path, fully immersed in the conservative talking head world and the theology to match. But I changed. Why? Well, it wasn't because I was being screamed at. That didn't convince me. It was people telling me their stories, their lived experiences, and asking questions that I just didn't have good answers to that eventually led me beyond the basement of evangelical fundamentalism to find more beautiful ways of allegiance to Jesus and to subversion of the empire. There have got to be better paths forward, and we have to do our best to invite people into it.